In the pre-dawn darkness of November 25, 1943, 5 American destroyers cut through the black waters off the southern tip of New Ireland, their hulls leaving phosphorescent wakes that glowed briefly before fading into the night. The sea was calm. The air temperature hovered near 80 degrees, and a thin haze hung over the horizon, obscuring the stars. Captain Arleigh Burke stood on the bridge of USS Charles Osborne, his eyes fixed on the radar screen's faint green glow. The time was 1:41 a.m. His task force, designated DesRon 23 Destroyer Squadron 23, had been hunting Japanese convoys in the waters between Rabaul and Bougainville for weeks. Tonight, the radar operator had just called out a contact bearing 310 degrees, ranged 22,000 yards. Burke lifted his binoculars. He saw nothing but darkness, but he knew what was out there. The Solomon Islands campaign had been grinding forward for 16 months. American forces had seized Guadalcanal in February 1943, but the Japanese still controlled Rabaul, their massive fortress on New Britain, and they were determined to hold Bougainville. Every few nights, fast Japanese destroyer convoys nicknamed the Tokyo Express or Rat Run by American sailors raced down from Rabaul carrying troops and supplies to isolated garrisons. These runs were dangerous for both sides. The narrow waters between the islands were treacherous, studded with reefs and uncharted shoals, and naval engagements usually erupted at point-blank range in total darkness. The Japanese had proven themselves masters of night combat. Their long-lance torpedoes were faster, longer-ranged, and more reliable than anything the Americans possessed. Their crews were veterans, trained in aggressive close-quarters tactics. In earlier battles at Savo Island, at Tassafaronga, at Kolombangara, Japanese destroyers had mauled Allied task forces, sinking cruisers and destroyers with devastating efficiency. American commanders had learned to approach these night actions with caution. Burke, however, had a different philosophy. Arleigh Burke was 42 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who had spent most of his career in staff assignments and cruiser billets. He had only taken command of Destroyer Squadron 23 in October 1943, but he had already earned a reputation for audacity. His superiors called him 31-knot Burke because he had once signaled, during a high-speed dash to intercept a Japanese force, that his destroyers could make 31 knots when official specifications listed their top speed as 30. Burke believed that American destroyers had 2 advantages the Japanese could not match: radar and coordinated firepower. The new SG surface search radar sets installed on his ships could detect enemy vessels at ranges exceeding 20 miles, even in total darkness. American 5-inch guns could fire faster and more accurately than Japanese equivalents, and their torpedoes, though less sophisticated than the Japanese long lance, could be aimed with radar precision. If Burke could find the enemy first, fix their position, close to effective range without being detected, and then strike with torpedoes before opening up with guns, he could negate their advantage entirely. It was a simple plan, but simple plans required perfect execution. On the night of November 24 and 25, American intelligence had intercepted Japanese radio traffic, indicating that a destroyer convoy would depart Rabaul and run south toward Buka, on the northern coast of Bougainville. Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 included the destroyers Charles Osborne, Claxton, Dyson, Converse, and Spence. The squadron was positioned off Cape St. George, at the southern tip of New Ireland, ready to intercept the enemy. The geography favored the Americans. Any Japanese convoy heading south from Rabaul had to pass through St. George Channel. It was a relatively narrow stretch of water between New Britain and New Ireland. Burke planned to wait in the darkness west of Cape St. George. He would use radar to detect the Japanese ships as they emerged from the channel. Then he would swing in behind them and attack from astern. Attacking from behind would allow his destroyers to close range without being silhouetted against the horizon. It would also give the Japanese fewer opportunities to launch torpedoes, since their tubes were trained to the beam and forward. Burke had studied the Japanese rat run pattern for weeks. He knew they typically sailed in single file at high speed, with minimal zigzagging, relying on darkness and speed for protection. If he could position his destroyers perfectly, He could strike the entire column before they even knew he was there. At 1:41 hours, the radar contact solidified. 5 ships, moving southeast at approximately 30 knots, range now down to 18,000 yards. Burke gave quiet orders. The 5 American destroyers swung onto an intercept course, increasing speed to 31 knots. The range closed steadily. Burke watched the radar plot. At 16,000 yards, he could see the enemy formation clearly. 5 ships in column, widely spaced. At 12,000 yards, he ordered his task force into battle formation 2 divisions, with Osborne, Claxton, and Dyson forming the lead division, and Converse and Spence trailing. The plan was for Burke's lead division to engage first, hitting the enemy column from astern with torpedoes, while the trailing division held position and maneuvered to cut off any ships attempting to escape. At 10,000 yards, Burke's fire control officer confirmed target solutions for the lead enemy ships. The range continued to close. 6,000 yards, Burke's hand rested on the bridge rail. His voice, when it came, was calm. At 01:55 hours, he gave the order, "Fire torpedoes." 15 American torpedoes leaped from the tubes of the 3 lead destroyers, 5 from each ship. They entered the water with muted splashes, their propellers spinning up, running hot and straight into the darkness at 45 knots. Burke held his gunfire. He didn't want muzzle flashes to give away his position before the torpedoes arrived. The Japanese crews on Onami and Makinami, the 2 rear ships in the enemy column, had no idea death was racing toward them through the black water. Burke counted the seconds. The torpedoes had nearly a mile to run. 60 seconds. 70. 80. The radar operator kept his eyes locked on the screen, tracking the enemy formation. The Japanese ships held their course, steady and unsuspecting. At 2 a.m., the night erupted. A massive explosion tore through the flagship Onami. American torpedoes struck her magazines. The blast was cataclysmic, a white-orange fireball that rose 200 feet into the air, illuminating the entire horizon for an instant before collapsing back into darkness. Onami didn't just sink, she disintegrated. Her forward section broke apart, her stern lifted vertically out of the water, and within moments she was gone, leaving only burning debris and scattered survivors clinging to wreckage. Almost simultaneously, Makinami, the second ship in the column, took a torpedo hit amidships. The explosion broke her keel. She slewed out of formation, dead in the water, listing heavily to port, flames spreading rapidly across her deck. Then Burke gave the order to open fire. All 3 lead American destroyers unleashed full salvos from their 5-inch gun mounts. Tracers arced across the darkness, converging on the crippled Makinami. The surprise was total. The Japanese had no warning, no time to maneuver, no opportunity to respond. American shells tore through Makinami's superstructure, her gun mounts, her engine spaces. Within 2 minutes, she was a blazing wreck, capsizing slowly as internal explosions rippled through her hull. She sank at 02:03 hours. Neither Onami nor Makinami had fired a single shot in return. The 3 remaining Japanese destroyers, Yūgiri, Uzuki, and Amagiri, now realized they were under attack. They increased speed and began to zigzag, attempting to break contact and flee northward. Burke ordered his division to pursue. The American destroyers raced after them at 33 knots, radar tracking their every move. The Japanese commanders, trained to close range and engage with torpedoes, found themselves in an impossible situation. They could not see the Americans. Their optical rangefinders were useless in the darkness. They fired torpedoes blindly, hoping to score a lucky hit, but the American destroyers, guided by radar, evaded every spread. Burke's ships, meanwhile, poured sustained fire into the fleeing column. At 02:05 hours, Yūgiri took multiple hits to her stern and midships. Fire consumed her deck. Her speed dropped. Burke's 2nd Division, Converse and Spence, closed in and finished her with concentrated gunfire. She capsized at 02:10 hours, her crew abandoning ship as she rolled over and sank. The remaining 2 Japanese destroyers were Uzuki and Amagiri. They managed to escape into a rain squall north of Cape St. George. Burke considered pursuit, but he decided against it. His destroyers were low on ammunition, and dawn was approaching. Japanese aircraft from Rabaul would be overhead within 2 hours. He ordered his task force to break off and retire southward. As the American destroyers withdrew, they passed the burning wreckage and floating debris where Onami, Makinami, and Yūgiri had gone down. All 3 were lost. Burke did not stop to pick up survivors. Enemy submarines and aircraft were too great a risk, but he noted the positions in his log. Japanese rescue vessels reached the area later that morning and recovered some of the survivors. Of the approximately 900 Japanese sailors and soldiers aboard the 3 destroyers, records suggest that fewer than 200 survived. The Battle of Cape St. George lasted 15 minutes. American ships fired approximately 4,000 5-inch shells. They also launched 15 torpedoes in the initial surprise attack. 3 torpedoes found their targets with devastating effect. Not a single American sailor was killed or wounded. Not one American ship suffered any damage. It was, by any measure, a perfect tactical victory. Post-war Japanese accounts, compiled from interrogation reports held at the U.S. Naval War College, reveal the complete shock experienced by the Japanese commanders. One surviving officer stated that the first indication of an American presence was the sudden explosion that destroyed Onami. "We had no radar contact, no visual sighting, no warning," he wrote. "The Americans struck from complete darkness with torpedoes we never saw coming. The flagships simply vanished." Another officer noted that the introduction of radar on American destroyers changed the nature of night combat completely, making traditional Japanese tactics obsolete. The immediate tactical victory was significant, but the strategic consequences extended further. The destruction of 3 destroyers in a single engagement forced the Japanese to reconsider their Tokyo Express operations. After Cape St. George, the frequency of destroyer runs to Bougainville dropped sharply. Japanese commanders began using submarines and barges for resupply. These methods were slower and less effective than fast destroyer transports. The reduction in supply deliveries contributed to the eventual collapse of Japanese resistance on Bougainville. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison later argued that Cape St. George marked the point at which American destroyer forces achieved clear superiority in the Solomon Islands night actions. The combination of radar fire control, aggressive tactics, superior training, and the successful execution of coordinated torpedo attacks had finally overcome the Japanese advantage in night fighting experience. Arleigh Burke's performance at Cape St. George earned him immediate recognition. He was promoted to Commodore and later became the youngest Rear Admiral in the U.S. Navy. After the war, he served 3 terms as Chief of Naval Operations, the longest tenure in the Navy's history. His tactical innovations using radar for night torpedo aiming and gunnery, attacking from unexpected vectors, launching surprise torpedo strikes before gun engagement, maintaining aggressive pursuit became standard doctrine in destroyer operations. The officers who served under him at Cape St. George later went on to command their own task forces in other battles. Destroyer Squadron 23, which Burke led for only 4 months, became one of the most decorated units in the Pacific War. The men who served on those 5 destroyers returned home after the war. Most of them resumed civilian lives with little fanfare. Burke himself rarely spoke publicly about Cape St. George. He preferred to credit his subordinates and the superiority of American technology. In post-war interviews, he emphasized that the victory resulted not from individual brilliance, but from training, preparation, and the ability of radar operators, torpedomen, and fire control teams to execute a complex plan under extreme pressure. Japanese naval officers, interviewed after the surrender, acknowledged that by late 1943, they knew that American destroyers had become formidable opponents. One former captain remarked, "We could no longer rely on darkness. The Americans had found a way to see in the night, and our advantage disappeared." The wreckage of the 3 Japanese destroyers still lies on the seabed off Cape St. George. They rest more than 2 miles below the surface. No salvage operations have ever been attempted. The battle is remembered in naval histories as a textbook example of radar-guided night combat, a moment when technology and tactics combine to produce a near-perfect tactical victory. But for the sailors who fought that night, the memory was simpler. The tense countdown as torpedoes raced toward unseen targets, the sudden flash of catastrophic detonation, 15 minutes of sustained fire, the glow of burning ships on the horizon, and the knowledge that they had survived an encounter that, a year earlier, might have ended very differently. In the logbooks of the destroyers, the entries from November 25, 1943, are brief and matter-of-fact. Enemy contacted, torpedoes fired, targets destroyed. No declarations of triumph. But in the radar rooms of those 5 ships, the green sweep continued turning, watching the seas ahead, and in that steady rotation alert, relentless. Unyielding, the balance of the Pacific War shifted, one engagement at a time, toward its inevitable conclusion.